year to require them to report things to the FTC and keep certain records and have to hire all the accountants and everything they'd have to have. It just doesn't make sense. We know that there have been some charlatan cemetery operators in the country, one obviously in Chairman Rush's home state of Illinois, but in that case, once it came to the attention of the Illinois governor and the Illinois legislature, prompt action was taken. There's been a task force created. They've made recommendations. It is not one of that task force recommendations that there be a federal law on cemeteries. With all the problems facing this country, Mr. Chairman, and all of the issues facing this committee, to move a federalization of cemetery regulation has got to go down as one of the least cost-effective, least desirable, least necessary bills, certainly in the last 5 or 6 years of this committee. So I cannot tell you how strongly I oppose the cemetery bill, and will continue to do so. I want to say one other thing, Mr. Chairman. We passed a bill at full committee a week or so ago that's coming to the floor tomorrow. During that markup, our newest member on the Republican side, Mr. Latta, offered an amendment for a pay-for. You encouraged him to withdraw that amendment, and I encouraged him, based on your word, to withdraw that amendment to work something out for a pay-for. It is my understanding that that has not been done, and that Mr. Latta is being pressured, Mr. Chairman, to forego working with you and your staff on that pay-for. I take it very personally when I put my integrity and my credibility behind you as chairman, and I hope that you will work with Mr. Latta, and if necessary myself, to come up with a satisfactory pay-for before that bill goes to the floor.
Gentlemen, yield.
I'll be happy to yield.
Well, I was going to talk to you privately, but I'm glad we brought this up before everybody. I want to continue to work with you and Mr. Latta on that issue. I did make a promise that we would try to work out an amendment. And before you accuse me of not keeping
I haven't accused you of anything.
Let's talk about it. But I think this burial bill ranks among bills like your bill on BCS, but federal government.
I'll take that as a fair criticism. The BCS bill is not.
It's not a criticism. It's a comparison.
Well, at least
there are some things important to some people.
That's true.
Other things important to other people.
I can accept that in the spirit in which it's given.
But I thank you for your comments.
So we will support on the calling bill, and we will strongly oppose the cemetery bill. And I'm going to encourage Mr. Latta that you will work with him on a pay-for before that bill goes to the floor.
And if somebody talked to him about some way of resolving it, I don't think that ought to be considered pressure. Talking about possible compromises or solutions to problems is not a pressure. But I'll work it out with you because you're the ranking member and you went to bat for me.
I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Other members seek to make opening statements. On the Democratic side, none. Gentleman from Kentucky, ranking member of the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad you're bringing up H.R. 3993 at the subcommittee level. We did address some of the concerns we heard regarding, for example, point-of-sale liability and this issue, as well as recognizing the need for a single uniform federal disclosure requirement in order for this legislation to be effective and meaningful for the benefit of consumers. So I'm delighted that we have the support to pass that legislation. As far as the Bereaved Consumers' Rights Act, which does direct the FTC to prescribe rules prohibiting unfair or deceptive practices over all funeral goods and services. We know that the funeral rule in existence today takes care of funeral homes, but it does not include cemeteries and other businesses offering goods and services that were traditionally offered only by funeral homes. I've spoken with many funeral home directors in my district, and everyone that I've talked to supports this bill. Now, I am concerned about the fact that it includes nonprofits. It also includes some religious cemeteries, and many of these do not have the manpower to meet these requirements. However, having said that, this bill does exempt any cemetery or business that does fewer than 25 interments a year. And we have a lot of small cemeteries in Kentucky. Many of them bury less than 25, so I do believe that this bill provides some protection for those least likely to meet its requirements. Yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. Any other members seek recognition for an opening statement? Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you for calling today's markup on two pieces of legislation that have been reported back to the full committee by the Subcommittee on Commerce, Trade, and Consumer Protection. And furthermore, I would like to commend you, along with Subcommittee Chairman Rush and Ranking Members Barton and Whitfield, for working to move these two bills, H.R. 3993 and H.R. 3655, through regular order. The first bill that we're considering today, H.R. 3993, the Calling Card Consumer Protection Act. In 2007, the prepaid calling card industry generated approximately $4 billion in revenues. However, despite this impact on the economy, many of these cards have numerous hidden charges that result in consumers only having available a fraction of the time that appears on the card itself. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 3993 directly addresses the fraud and abuse within the prepaid calling card industry by requiring providers and distributors to clearly list all pertinent information to consumers. Additionally, it gives the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, the ability to enforce this legislation. I was very happy to see the CTCP subcommittee adopt a strongly bipartisan manager's amendment to this legislation when it was considered at the subcommittee level last month in March. I believe that H.R. 3993 represents the very best of policymaking as we have worked across the aisle for the sake of consumer interest, and I look forward to supporting this important legislation today. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 3655, the Bereaved Consumers Bill of Rights Act, was crafted largely in response to the incident that occurred at Burr Oak Cemetery in also Illinois that resulted in charges of the unauthorized removal of human remains from graves and subsequent reselling of those plots. As the story continued to unravel, shocking details were revealed, and my deepest condolences go out to the families of those whose remains were desecrated. Unfortunately, this is not an isolated incident. In my home state of Georgia, just outside of my congressional district, the 11th of Georgia, a national scandal on this very issue occurred. Back in 2002, the Tri-State Crematory in Walker County was the center of a criminal investigation where the company failed to cremate the remains of over 300 people, and even worse than that, they improperly stored the remains, actually many of them just lying on the ground of the property. For the families of Northwest Georgia that this scandal affected, I feel nothing but sorrow for the trauma that they experienced, as was the case in Illinois. While these incidents are tragic and deplorable, I do have concerns about the legislation before us today. Despite the good intentions of H.R. 3655, within the last day, I have been contacted by industry stakeholders who have raised serious concerns over provisions within this bill, including the lack of an exemption for religiously based cemeteries from being included in the FTC's jurisdiction. I believe that we should use this forum today to address these important reservations that I have, and I feel sure others have, about H.R. 3655. Mr. Chairman, with these concerns in mind, I look forward to the debate on the bill today, and again, I do appreciate the efforts made to ensure that these bills have gone through regular order in this committee. And thank you for your indulgence, and I see I've gone a little over my time, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Any other opening statements? If not, the chair will consider, the chair calls H.R. 3993 the Calling Card Consumer Protection Act. The committee will consider as base text the bill as amended by the Subcommittee on Commerce, Trade, and Consumer Protection. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I have a manager's amendment at the desk, and without objection, that will be considered as read. The chair recognizes himself. The bipartisan manager's amendment I'm offering makes one technical change to H.R. 3993. The amendment provides the Federal Trade Commission with flexibility to limit the required disclosures on advertising and promotional materials for prepaid calling cards. Under the bill as forwarded to the committee, the Commission already has this flexibility with respect to disclosures on prepaid calling cards themselves. This flexibility is important and should be available to FTC as it develops all of the disclosures called for in this bill. I'd like to thank members and staff from both sides of the aisle for their work on this legislation. In particular, I would like to thank Mr. Engel for his leadership. I wish I could do it, and I'm pleased to be able to do it personally now that he's here, and for introducing this critical piece of legislation. I urge my colleagues to support the manager's amendment. Mr. Barton?
Mr. Chairman, I support the manager's amendment and support the underlying bill that it affects.
Mr. Engel?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton and I did this bill together, and I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for marking up this legislation. H.R. 3993, Calling Card Consumer Protection Act. I want to thank Bobby Rush for his work on this legislation, as well as the dedicated staff of the Consumer Protection Committee. Calling cards are an invaluable resource for a number of people who make frequent long-distance or overseas calls. Students, members of the armed forces, and those whose family lives outside of the country regularly use these cards to call home. The cards are also popular among people who either choose not to subscribe to long-distance telephone service or who cannot afford to have it. They're a necessary tool for keeping in touch with friends or family members. Calling cards that provide the services that the companies advertise can save consumers a great deal of money when they call home. But the reason for this bill, Mr. Chairman, as you know and you've stated, as we see too often, a number of unscrupulous companies are failing to keep their advertised terms. I first learned of this issue about 3 years ago when I heard from a number of constituents who said that their prepaid calling cards were not delivering the number of minutes that they advertised. In fact, many were not even close to delivering the promised number of minutes. When I heard about these problems, I purchased a calling card to investigate the problem for myself. And what shocked me, although it should come as no surprise to anybody now, is that I found the exact same problems my constituents were having. One of these companies promised me a certain number of minutes, and I found that it was a complete fabrication. I didn't receive even close to the number of minutes that the card advertised. This is when I decided to introduce my legislation to ban this practice. I've read studies conducted by states' attorneys general as well as by independent groups, showing that many calling cards provide far fewer minutes than are advertised. One study by the Hispanic Institute found that on average the caller only received 60% of the minutes guaranteed by the card. I recently read that the prepaid calling card industry takes in $4 billion a year in revenue, and if the cards are only providing 60% of the minutes, we can all do the math. This deception is costing consumers and honest companies hundreds of millions of dollars every year. Calling card fraud harms segments of the population who are among the most vulnerable to being victimized by unscrupulous companies only seeking to make a quick profit. Companies will target poor, minority, and immigrant populations, and they don't stop there. They've even preyed upon our soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's obviously unconscionable. In an article in Businessweek magazine, the author detailed one example of a company that marketed towards Spanish-speaking consumers and it packaged with Spanish-language information. But the fine print that detailed all the various fees they would charge the user was in English. When confronted about this deception, the company simply said, "We're in America." They had the audacity to claim that even when they put Spanish-language advertisements in markets with Spanish-speaking consumers, they can hide all their fees in English. So in conclusion, this legislation would put a stop to a number of deceptive practices employed by unscrupulous companies. It would require calling cards and advertisements to include a clear disclosure of all terms, conditions, and fees in the language in which the calling card is advertised. Just like the nutrition information on a box of cereal, consumers should be able to quickly and easily compare two products side by side. I would strongly encourage the members of this committee to support this bipartisan, well-thought-out legislation. And, Mr. Chairman, again, thank you for marking this up. I yield back the balance of my time.
Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? If not, we'll proceed to a vote on the manager's amendment. All those in favor of the manager's amendment will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is approved. Are there other amendments to the bill? If not, the Chair moves to order reported H.R. 3993 as amended with the usual instructions. All those in favor of that amendment, of that motion will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is passed out of committee. The committee will now consider H 3655, the Bereaved Consumers Bill of Rights. We will consider as base text the bill as amended by the Subcommittee on Commerce, Trade, and Consumer Protection. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Mr. Barton, I believe you have an amendment. Do you wish to offer it?
I have an amendment if it's appropriate at this time to offer.
Yeah, it is. Clerk will report the amendment. And
amendment to H.R. 3655, offered by Mr. Barton.
without objection, that amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the chairman for recognizing me to offer an amendment. I don't want to regurgitate what I said in my opening statement, Mr. Chairman. Suffice it to say that I'm strongly opposed to the bill. I have done probably several hundred public meetings in the last year and a half in or near my congressional district. I've not had one constituent stand up and tell me that we need more federal regulation of cemeteries. It's not an issue that's in the top 100 or the top 500 or even the top 1,000. So what my amendment does is strike the bill and substitute the mandatory rulemaking required of the FTC in the current bill into a study to examine the extent of fraud and deception in the market for funeral and cemetery services. The amendment would specifically direct the Federal Trade Commission to examine the accuracy of disclosures to consumers who were purchasing burial plots, to examine whether contracts for services that cemeteries provide are understandable to the average consumer. It would also require the FTC to examine existing state laws, report on their strength and consistency of the various state laws, the relationship of existing state law to the funeral rule, which is currently being enforced by the Federal Trade Commission, and would also require a study of the extent to which state laws are enforced against nonprofit cemetery association. My amendment would require a report by the Federal Trade Commission back to the Congress within 18 months with recommendations for minimum requirements states should adopt to prevent unfair and deceptive acts by cemetery associations. It maintains the spirit of H.R. 3655, which is to prevent fraud like that which has occurred at the Burr Oak Cemetery in Illinois that Mr. Rush has rightfully been so outraged by. But it would permit the state to continue to regulate what really is, Mr. Chairman, a state issue and not a federal issue. The problems and objections that we've heard from religious organizations, and which is why the bill before us is going to have an exemption for religious cemeteries, just shows why we should have an exemption for all cemeteries. Why don't we study the problem, Mr. Chairman, let the FTC take adequate amount of time and resources to report back to us, and if we need to act on this in the next Congress, we can take it under advisement at that time. So this converts the bill from an action mandatory rulemaking to a study by the Federal Trade Commission, which is the agency that has jurisdiction at this time.
Chair recognizes himself in opposition to the amendment. There are two amendments that I know of that are going to be considered on this bill. This is the first. The next will be the religious issue. This amendment would eliminate the rulemaking and instead ask the Federal Trade Commission to study the funeral industry and issue recommendations to the states regarding minimum consumer protections. The amendment sponsors argue there's no federal role here, and we should rely on the states. I think that usually makes good sense, but what we've seen is there are states that don't act to protect their consumers, and therefore I disagree with this amendment. The sponsor of the legislation has made a strong case for the need for minimum federal standards. The FTC already sets these standards for funeral homes, and those are often regulated by the states, but the FTC sets standards for funeral homes. It makes sense that this agency would set similar standards for cemeteries and the rest of the funeral industry. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. And I want to yield to Mr. Rush to talk about why this bill is needed and why we shouldn't allow the amendment to be passed that would strike the whole bill and substitute only a study. Mr. Rush?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, there is an established need for a federal role here. There are some who would encourage the states to pass consumer protection laws, but not create a federal standard. And I think this would be a mistake. Mr. Chairman, we've had extensive hearings in Chicago, my home city rather, and here in this very same committee room. And the testimony is pretty clear and pretty persuasive that there are only 10 states, if I recall, that have any laws at all, any standards for operation of cemeteries. And the world became aware of a mid-sized cemetery in my district where the burial vaults was dug up and opened. There was all kinds of disrespect, disrepair occurring. And it had been going on for years, and there was little to no oversight at the state level and also at the federal level. This particular cemetery was the resting ground for one of the icons of the civil rights movement, a young man who actually whose brutal murder in Mississippi in 1955 rather, kind of laid the foundation for the civil rights movement that forever changed America. We have got to do something about these cemeteries. I mean, we are leaving consumers open to the whims of operators throughout the nation, and this bill is a minimum federal standard. It's nothing that's so pervasive. It's nothing that would really alter the business schemes of the various cemeteries. This is a bill, I think, that this creates a minimum federal standards. Mr. Chairman, I think that the FCC has done a remarkable job as it relates to the regulation and setting standards for the funeral businesses, funeral homes themselves, to have the cemeteries operating without any regulation, without any standards, will indeed just make the FTC's job much more difficult, and it will create really a situation where the consumer would look at the funeral homes and think that the funeral homes are really the problem. When it's not the funeral homes, it's really the cemeteries. And I think that this committee will be doing the American people a real big favor, and we'll be doing our work that we were all elected to do by protecting those of us who at some point in time will find a day. The day will come when we will all, or our loved ones, will be faced with critical decisions about not only a funeral director, but also about a cemetery. And we need to ensure that those individuals, and we, when we get to that point, that we are doing our best for the American consumer. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. Any further debate on the Barton Amendment? Yes, gentleman from Arizona.
I yield to Congressman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Wait a minute.
Wait,
I think he recognized Mr. Shadegg.
Mr. Shadegg from Arizona. Mr. Hall, did you want to be recognized? You come first in seniority.
If you now that you know what I'm going to do, you're going to still recognize me? Yes.
You still going to ask for recognition, or
Show you first.
are you going to jump ahead of Mr. Shattuck?
Yeah.
Who seeks recognition on the Republican side?
I do,
Mr. Hall.
recognize Mr. Barton, yield to Mr. Barton first.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. I just want to ask Chairman Rush some questions. We understand how outraged you are about what happened at the Burr Oak Cemetery, and I personally share that outrage. I'm absolutely appalled by it, and I can't state in the strongest terms.
So that means you're going to vote with me?
No, but I want to ask you some questions. I am told that the perpetrators have been arrested, were initially put in jail, and have been out on bond but are awaiting trial. Is that your understanding?
I think you're correct in that regard, yes.
It's also my understanding that the charges against them are criminal charges. Is that your understanding?
Yes, that's my understanding.
Yeah. I have faith in the jury system, and I have faith in the judges in Illinois. What is your judgment on? I know you can't prejudge what a jury or a judge is going to do. That's why you have the trial. But if the evidence is as strong as it appears to be, it would be my judgment that these folks will be convicted and will be sent to the Illinois State Penitentiary. Do you share that view?
I do.
Okay. If, in fact, what you and I both believe is going to happen in the situation that you're so justifiably outraged about, why, in your judgment, do we need to federalize this issue if the state, in your case, the state of Illinois, is taking appropriate action?
Well, the ranking member, Mr. Barton, I'm glad you asked that question because I've been asking that question myself. And let me tell you the answer that I've come up with. Illinois is all right. It's going to get taken care of. We have, my state have created some protections, not just civil, not just criminal protections, but they've also created some other protections. But do you know that Burr Oaks wasn't the only cemetery that had these kind of gross violations? There are cemeteries across the nation that didn't get the kind of publicity that Burr Oaks got. But in Georgia and other states, there are similar actions going on where there have been acts conducted by cemetery owners that are really abhorrent. And that really was the impetus for this bill, not to deal with the Burr Oaks. It's not a localized situation. I would not come here and ask the members of this committee to correct or wrong using our authority on a national level to deal with an isolated local Illinois problem. This is a national problem. I repeat, only 10 cemeteries, only 10 states rather, out of 50, only 10 states regulates the activities of cemeteries.
Well, then we could, if you would support the Barton Amendment to conduct this study and get the facts, we could come back in the next Congress and address those issues that states are not adequately addressing, if that in fact is the case.
Will one of the gentlemen from Texas yield him?
If I'm still controlling Mr. Hall's time, I'll be happy to yield to the chairman.
I think the purpose of this bill is not to prosecute those who have acted in such an abhorrent way, but it's to try to prevent this sort of thing from happening by setting up minimum standards at cemeteries so that people will know that they'll be violating federal law, maybe state law as well, but certainly federal law if they do these kinds of things. So it's better to have the law clear, let people know that they're going to violate it if they do these things. And if a state is also enforcing criminal actions, that's an after-the-fact way of handling it, but it's also effective to deter.
Reclaiming Mr. Hall's time, not every issue has to be federalized. I'll suggest to my two distinguished chairmen. And I don't know of any state or locality or any state legislature or any state governor in the country, if they are made aware that these kind of abominable acts are going on, wouldn't act immediately in the strongest possible terms. In the cemetery association that my family's involved in, if somebody were to go out and desecrate a grave, the county judge, the sheriff, the Texas Rangers, you name it, they'd be after those people in a flash, and you would have to restrain the local population from dispensing justice immediately, as opposed to putting them in the county jail and then going through the judicial system. So I don't think there's any daylight anywhere in the country if people go in and desecrate and people who are deceased loved ones who've been buried. This time has expired, but I would strongly hope that we could accept the Barton Amendment and study this problem. And I thank Mr. Hall for yielding to me.
Gentleman's time has expired. Who else seeks recognition on the Barton Amendment? Mr. Shattuck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I rise in strong support of the amendment proposed by the ranking member. I do begin by expressing my sympathy to the victims of the fraud committed at Burr Oaks and the fraud committed in Georgia in the district adjoining Mr. Gingry's. However, I would note that while frauds like that do occur, and they ought to be of concern to all of us, and we ought to be worried about that kind of conduct wherever it occurs, as the sponsor of this bill just acknowledged, Illinois has taken care of the problem and addressed it. I believe Georgia is currently addressing it. I would argue very strongly that really there are two very strong arguments for not enacting this law, certainly for not enacting it at this time. Number one, we are in an extraordinary time in this nation when resources are extremely short. We've just gone through a vigorous debate over health care reform and over the excessive cost of health care. There are literally countless demands on the federal government to take care of things within its own sphere of responsibility, things which legitimately are national in scope, things which cannot be regulated by any one state. Dealing, for example, finding the resources to deal with the oil spill, which is currently occurring off the coast in the Gulf and threatens numerous states. There are literally vastly more demands on our resources, our time, our money as a federal government than we can possibly pay for right now. And to divert our resources and our attention to something which the states should be doing, I think, is a grave disservice. And I would argue that this is not the right time to federalize this issue, to make what clearly should be a state issue into a federal one, and to divert scarce resources to that task. Second, I believe it is absolutely correct that the states ought to act, and that we ought to have, many of us served in state legislatures before we came here. Many of us were thoughtful and aggressive and worked hard in those jobs. Many of us understood the obligation of protecting our constituents in those states and the jurisdiction of those states. I think for us as a federal body to step in and take that authority away from them.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'd like to finish making my point, and then I'd be happy to yield. I believe that is an act of disrespect to the various states and to the governors, to the legislators in those states who take their responsibilities seriously, and to the state legislatures themselves. And indeed, in my home state, we have a regulatory authority over both cemeteries and funeral homes. And the Arizona Attorney General's office, where I previously worked, took its responsibility of aggressively pursuing all frauds very seriously and worked very, very hard to protect the people of Arizona and to allocate state resources to that task. And at least so far as I know, there simply has not been made in this markup today or in any hearing on this legislation before now a case that indeed this is in a unique federal responsibility that affects interstate commerce, that calls upon the dedication of federal resources, and that what we look at here, while perhaps offensive and perhaps abusive to the people who have been victimized. And I spent a fair amount of time working on victims issue when I was in the Arizona Attorney General's office, and I have the greatest sympathy for the victims of every kind of fraud, but particularly for the victims of this kind of fraud. I think it is simply a mistake. And I would make one final point, and that is when we purport to make these issues a federal issue and purport to create in the minds of the American people the belief that the federal government will step in all 50 states and solve this kind of problem, and that We hold out to the people the prospect that we have the resources, the money, the time, the people to enforce this kind of law at the federal level. We create an illusion which is not correct. The reality is there are too many demands on our resources. The reality is we will not step into all 50 states. The reality is we're making so many demands on the states, they need to allocate their resources to those things that are within their jurisdiction, and we need to be allocating our time, money, energy, resources, and personnel, including personnel that would be vested with this authority under the legislation. We need to focus that on things which are of interstate concern and of federal concern, and that cannot be resolved by the states themselves. And with that, I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman from Illinois.
Yeah, I thank the gentleman for yielding. You know, I hear your arguments, and your concerns were addressed back in 1984, but the Congress decided that this was a proper area and a proper role for the Congress to play, and that's why they passed the.
I understand that point. Reclaiming my time. Indeed, I heard the chairman of the full committee make the point that we've already got this regulated at the federal level because we already have a federal regulation of funeral homes, not cemeteries. I guess that actually makes the point. The reality is just because we did it then, and it did not, I think, adequately solve the problem then, does not become a justification for making the same mistake now. And I thank the gentleman for the indulgence, and I've run over my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Who seeks recognition? Mr. Gingrey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too strongly support the Barton Amendment. You know, when we had hearings on this issue, and one of the witnesses, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Rush, your witness, not our witness, Judge Patricia Brown Holmes, a retired judge from the state of Illinois, who chaired, I think it was called the Cemetery Oversight Task Force. Governor Quinn, I believe, appointed that task force, and Judge Brown Holmes was the chairperson. And their investigation, I think it was over several months, led to the passage of the Crematory or Cemetery Oversight Act, and that indeed was passed by the Illinois legislature. I think this is a perfect example of the fact that the states can handle this problem. It was mentioned about my own state of Georgia, and of course, in reference to the tri-state crematory case back that occurred in 2002. Well, ultimately, the plaintiffs in that case were awarded about $54 million in damages against Tri-State Crematory, and the owner of that crematory, Ray Brent Marsh, is now serving a 12-year prison term. And now the latest thing that we see in regard to what the states can do comes from the state of Maryland, right here in Maryland, Riverdale, in regard to Chambers Funeral Home. They were just relieved of their license, and pretty promptly, for some of these type of abuses. So again, I think that the Barton Amendment is the ideal approach, to look at this, to study, to make sure, and maybe recommendations that could follow the examples, particularly of the state of Illinois in regard to what they did with the Cemetery Oversight Act. So, Mr. Chairman, I strongly, strongly support the Barton Amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Gingrey. Are we ready for the vote?
Yeah.
Do you wish to?
The gentleman, will you just want?
Well, I'll recognize you.
Well, all right. Let me say that you're in Illinois. Again, we have done a significant job in terms of trying to address this problem. But this problem is just not relegated to the state of Illinois. It's a far-reaching issue all across the nation. Judge Holmes, Brown Holmes, she also indicated, and she did this very dramatically at the hearing, she said that had this law been in effect, then Burr Oak would have occurred. It would not have occurred in Illinois. So I think that she, in essence, was supportive of the direction and the spirit of this bill. So I would just encourage all the members here to understand that at their most vulnerable point, a consumer at their most vulnerable point, they are at the whims and of the not only the funeral directors, but also at the directors of the cemeteries. They're exploited at their most vulnerable point. And I can't think of any other noble effort that this Congress could take than to try to protect the American citizens at indeed their most vulnerable point. We all will reach that point one day. And I think that this bill is not a bill that's so invasive and so difficult, but this is a bill that's a common sense bill, and it's actually providing some minimal standards for the American consumer. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Let's proceed to the vote. All those in favor of the Barton Amendment will say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No.
Mr. Chairman, I will call it first.
Well, the noes have it.
Well, if the noes have it, I ask for a roll call vote.
Let's go to a roll call vote.
I thought the ayes had it, so I thought you might call it for the ayes, but we'll call the roll.
Mr. Waxman.
No.
Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon votes no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, no. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Ms. DeGette. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Weiner. How am I recorded? Not recorded, Mr. Chairman.
No, please.
Mr. Weiner votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Mr. Braley. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Whitfield.
No.
Mr. Whitfield, no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bono Mack. Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mrs. Myrick? Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy, Pennsylvania? Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn? Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Griffith? Mr. Latta? Mr. Latta, aye. Mr. Green? Mr. Green votes no. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey, no. Ms. Sutton? Ms. Sutton votes no. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley, no. Oh, Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel votes no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes, no.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? Any member wish to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will tally the vote. Clerk's ready to announce the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the yeas were 13, the nays were 31.
13 ayes, 31 noes. The amendment's not agreed to. Further amendments to the legislation. Mr. Gingrey, do you have an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. This basically is the religious exemption amendment. Basically, nonprofits, including religious organizations, are statutorily exempt from the Federal Trade Commission Act, but they have been placed under FTC jurisdiction for the purpose of this particular act. So I support the amendment to keep religious organizations outside of the FTC's jurisdiction. Religious nonprofit organizations that run cemeteries on behalf of their members have never been responsible for any of the problems associated with criminal acts such as those that took place at Burr Oak or Tri-State that we've talked about in regard to this bill. There's simply no evidence they need to be regulated, especially not by the federal government. Many states have specifically carved out religious and other nonprofit cemeteries from their state regulatory requirements in recognition that the cemeteries serve their membership. They should not be encumbered with inapplicable federal record-keeping requirements that detract from their mission to serve others. So that's the amendment simply in a nutshell, Mr. Chairman. I'll be happy to take any questions, but I certainly think that this is an amendment that members on both sides of the aisle could support, would support, want to support. I'm certainly open to any amendment to the amendment that the majority side may be considering. I understand that there was some additional language that was discussed between the staffs that you may want to add a line basically that says, and that are not organized, operated, managed, or owned by contract or affiliation with a for-profit provider of funeral goods or services. That language would be perfectly acceptable to me, Mr. Chairman, if anyone either on the minority or majority side wanted to amend my amendment. But I commit this amendment to you, and I hope that we can pass it. I think it'll make the bill better.
Would the gentleman yield
Chairman?
before he yields back?
I'll be happy to yield.
Could you just inform me, I'm new to the issue, do most states that regulate cemeteries, do they have a similar exemption in state laws, is it your understanding? I mean, I don't know.
And I reclaim my time, Mr. Weiner. I'm not sure about most, but I do know that a number of states do. I don't have the exact, maybe staff on our side might have that information, but many do.
Yeah.
Mr. Gingrey, Mr. Gingrey, would you yield?
Yes, I'll yield.
Right here.
I yield to Mr. Whitfield from Kentucky.
It's my understanding, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that under the existing FTC Act, religious organizations are exempt. Is that correct?
Reclaiming my time, the gentleman is right. They are exempt under the FTC rules.
Okay. Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman, yield back his time.
Mr. Chairman, I do yield back if there are no other
Yields
questions.
back his time. Further discussion. Ms. Harmon, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
Well, either to support Mr. Gingry's amendment as he suggested it be amended, or to call up an amendment in the nature of a substitute,
Well, generally,
which would add that language. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right. Then I would, I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk and ask that it be distributed.
Parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, gentleman will state his parliamentary
I'm not
inquiry.
opposed to the Harmon amendment, but I do have a question under the rules that we're operating. Is the second degree amendment in order?
Yes, it is. There is no substitute amendment that's pending. It's the text, base text of what was reported out of committee.
Well, I thought Mr. Gingry's, Dr. Gingry's amendment was made in order
as a first degree amendment.
So is the second degree amendment to his amendment in order, since his amendment is the pending business? That's my question.
Ordinarily, a chair would not give advisory opinions, but it's my understanding if you pursued a point of order, I would.
That's why I'm asking.
Yes, well, it would be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Ms. Harmon, you have an amendment at the
I
desk.
do.
The clerk will report the
And
amendment.
it could be an amendment in the second degree. It is certainly a friendly amendment because Mr. Gingry, Dr. Gingry, just read the language that my amendment would add to his amendment to make it crystal clear that the only...
Well, before you get into that, without objection, the amendment in the second degree is considered as read. Now you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To make it crystal clear that the only religious cemeteries that we are exempting from this law are those that are not for-profit cemeteries. The language that you offered, Dr. Gingry, at least as I read it, doesn't make that clear, and so this would add the text that you read in order to make it clear. I want to say a couple things. First of all, I think that the event that occurred in Illinois that has spurred Mr. Rush's enormous interest in this issue is absolutely horrific, and I think this committee on a unified basis condemns it. And I do think there is a role for federal law here, which some might dispute, but I see why we are doing this. But we have always, in our history, managed a way to protect church autonomy and the free exercise of rights. And so we need to strike a balance in this new law, and that is what the Harmon substitute to the Gingry amendment is intended to do. Based on Dr. Gingry's comments, I think that there is, I don't know about unanimous, but certainly bipartisan support for doing this, and I would just like to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a letter from Rabbi David Saperstein, whom many know, that discusses why this language should be acceptable to a wide array of religious groups across the spectrum. And so I would ask support for the substitute / amendment in the second degree / Gingry Harmon amendment, and yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back her time. Further recognition on the Harmon amendment in the second degree. If not, we'll proceed to a vote. All those in favor?
Chairman.
Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. I do understand the author of the amendment. I understand her intentions, and I have no problems with her intentions at all and her motivation. But let me just be real clear here to all the members of the committee. These exemptions would put not only the FCC at a distinct disadvantage, but it would also put the American consumer at another disadvantage, because you will put them in a situation where they have to, beforehand, during a most critical time in their lives, they have to be able to gauge whether or not which type of cemetery are they dealing with. That's the first point. You know, we should not. We need to understand and give recognition and good full acknowledgement and thought to the fact that at a family's most vulnerable point, deciding upon where they're going to place their deceased loved one for eternity, that's a pretty serious and an acute point that they find themselves in. I am the last one who would be in favor of any kind of religious overburden of any kind of religious, sexual, or religion practice or any other type of religious prohibitions here. I am here in this Congress. I am an ordained minister. I've been ordained for 10 years. I pastor a church. I've pastored the church for 10 years, so I'm very, very sensitive to the issues of that we're discussing here. However, I do believe that if we will bring forth this amendment, if we would pass this amendment as a carve-out for religious organizations, then in fact what we would be doing is gutting the entire bill. The bill wouldn't even be worth the paper that it's written on. Let me just give you some examples of...
Gentlemen, yield to me.
I yield to
Are you urging us to vote against the Gingrey amendment, even if it were amended by the Harmon amendment?
I am, Mr. Chairman, and I know that the position I'm placing the committee in, but I really sincerely believe that if we have any carve-outs, we have any exemption from this particular, these minimal standards, that indeed what we would be doing is gutting the entire bill, and we would be leaving the American people once again to the potential of an outrageous act by one or more cemeteries somewhere in the future. Mr. Chairman, this problem is, again, I want to reiterate, this problem is not restricted to Illinois. We've had some problems. There was a Davis funeral home that threatened to refuse to accommodate traditional Muslim burial practice, which stipulates burials in light shroud without a heavy casket. This occurred in Nevada. In another state, a lady, American lady by the name of Janet Bono describes her unpleasant experience, her unpleasant experience of purchasing a monument to her father's grave. She was prized to be quoted a foundation fee at a cemetery where numerous monuments stood without a foundation, while others rested on foundations of poor craftsmanship. In light of the poor upkeep of other grave sites at the cemetery, Bono expressed concerns about paying for a foundation that may not be maintained. This was in another state. And then, Mr. Chairman, there's one additional one that I want to bring to the attention of the committee here. And this is the Cabot Funeral Home in Riverside. Ronald Holmes complained that an official of the cemetery where Holmes' sister is interred is either unable or unwilling to provide information regarding the location of the burial plot of Holmes' sister. Holmes contacted the official many times, but never heard from him until a Woodstock town official, at Holmes' urging, contacted the cemetery official. Mr. Chairman, these abhorrent kind of practices are very personal, and they're very powerful. We have to take the consideration of the voiceless American citizen, the consumer, who is really at the mercy of these, in some instances, cold-hearted, callous, and unscrupulous cemetery owners. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Wiener.
Well, if I could just be briefly recognized for the purpose of asking, I don't know if it's Ms. Harmon or Mr. Gingrey, Ms. Harmon, is this a church-state thing? I mean, it seems to me that whether it's nonprofit, religious, or not, it's still someone paying money, very often, to have their loved one buried. And isn't I mean, just to take up what the chairman of the subcommittee said, isn't this a function that we're trying to provide protections for consumers, and why should they be less protected in a religious environment than a non? Just so I'm not sure I understand the rationale.
Yeah, my amendment, which I think Dr. Gingrey supports, would narrow his amendment to limit it to nonprofit religious organizations. And yes, I said in my opening remarks that I think there are some values that we have to balance and have traditionally balanced, but we're carving a very narrow exception to a very good bill. And I would yield to Dr. Gingrey for some.
Well, but before you do, a similar religious organization that operates as a nonprofit, let's assume, I don't know how narrow that is, but let's assume for a moment that you still have the same transactions going on, and this could be a pretty big carve-out, actually, right? If you say a religious organization, particularly, I mean...
Gentlemen, yield.
Yeah, go ahead.
As I understand the argument, there are religious groups. For example, the Catholic Church. They own the burial ground. They have the people from the parish buried there, perhaps for generations. They are not a profit-making organization, and they feel they shouldn't be regulated by a Federal Trade Commission because it's strictly a religious organization doing part of the service for their parishioners. The same as any other religious organization that is not involved in profit-making. They don't hire people to run their cemetery. They're running the cemetery. So the Harmon Amendment would exempt that slice of religious groups that operate O&Os, owned and operated by the religion itself. That would be what Ms. Harmon would seek to narrow the Gingrey Amendment to. And
yeah, but if I can just briefly reclaim, but
Sure.
this leaves you could be a church or a religious organization, not even a church, and you can run a giant cemetery as a nonprofit. Nothing prevents you from hiring people under this. You can still hire batteries of people. Mm-hmm. And I think the Trade Commission part is it's still a trade. The consumer is still... Now, maybe the way to do the exemption is to say that if you don't accept any payment, that if the church just chooses to give it as a service to its parishioners...
Mr. Chairman, if the gentleman would yield to me.
Yeah, sure.
Well, I thank the gentleman from New York for yielding. Again, I strongly support the language in the second-degree amendment that Representative Harmon has submitted. And it just clearly says that if any large religious organization, be it a Catholic cemetery or a Jewish cemetery or a Baptist cemetery, if they actually employ some for-profit organization to run the business of just what Mr. Weiner is talking about, then there would be no exemption in that case.
No, but if I can just reclaim, but if they hired 500 people to run their cemetery, hire them. They're not exempt. They're exempt under this bill from having any consumer protections that are granted by the bill. I just don't understand.
If the gentleman will yield to me just for another second, and the gentleman is right, but as I pointed out in talking about my amendment, that no religious cemetery has ever, to my knowledge, been charged with any of these abuses that we have seen at Tri-State in Georgia, or at Burr Oak in Illinois, or this cemetery, Chambers Cemetery in Maryland. Those type activities just do not occur in the religious cemeteries the gentleman from New York is talking about. Let me just make one other point, and that is that these churches consider this ground sacred ground. It's almost part of their religious right. It's not just a burial place. So I think it's altogether appropriate that we do have carve-out for these cemeteries, and I do agree completely with the amendment in the nature of actually a second-degree amendment that Ms. Harmon, and I yield back to the gentleman.
May I have a
gentleman yields back.
There's a technical issue here, Mr. Gingrey. Your amendment calls for the
gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, is recognized on his own time.
Okay, thank you. The amendment offered by Mr. Gingrey has the "or" term, so cemeteries organized, operated, or owned, whereas the amendment to the amendment has "anded," cemeteries organized, operated, managed, and owned. So it's a much narrower, the amendment is much narrower in its scope.
Yeah. If you would yield to me?
Yes.
That's the intent. I mean, we are, as I said earlier, balancing some values. It is really important to protect consumers, but it is also really important to recognize that many religions consider their religious cemeteries as sacred ground. And I think this is a difficult area to regulate, and we are trying to walk the tightest walk we can. And that's why this amendment in the second degree was drafted as it was drafted. And I appreciate the gentleman for pointing out the "and" rather than the "or."
Will the gentleman from California yield to me?
Yes.
Another argument, I believe, for supporting the Harmon Amendment and the Gingrey Amendment is, as I said earlier, under the existing funeral home law, in which the FTC regulates funeral homes, religious organizations are exempt under current federal law, and the Harmon Amendment and the Gingrey Amendment would simply make this consistent with that. As they try to regulate cemeteries, it would be consistent with the existing law. So I think that's another argument in favor of the Harmon-Gingrey Amendment.
Gentleman, yield back his time.
Yes.
We ready for the vote? Mr. Murphy.
Just real quick on this, after hearing Mr. Wiener's comments, I wanted to say something. In the process of full disclosure, I used to work in a Catholic cemetery. You wouldn't know it, but I mowed lawns and dug graves, and my father was a superintendent of one. And I know that these cemeteries are done for religious purposes, too. I also want to make it clear that I believe the amendment and the secondary amendment that's being offered is important, because you also have places which are convents and monasteries which operate cemeteries, oftentimes on no budget at all, and it's important we do not add to the costs of those and respect that those who are practicing their faith, whatever religion it is, they have those the places to do that. And it is important that, because they are not only nonprofit but many times barely making it through, that we do not add things that crush the costs on those cemeteries. Goodness knows that as time goes on, these cemeteries provide care in perpetuity. And it is tough for them to continue to do that, and many times the churches themselves have to add funds to make sure that those cemeteries are upheld in a respectful way for those who have passed. And so along those lines, I think it is essential that we support this amendment and the secondary amendment as a means of respecting that, and also making sure we do not add to the cost of those cemeteries. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. We have a request from Mr. Barton that we have a 5-minute break so that the Republicans can have an opportunity to discuss this issue. Without objection, we will recess for 5 minutes. And after that, we'll proceed to the vote.